Oh. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thanks everybody for being here this morning. For those unfamiliar with me, I'm Dave Kirk in criminology. It's my pleasure to introduce Nicolò Cavalli from Bocconi University. He's a professor there, started back in 2020, I think, after doing DPhil at Oxford.
We do.
With me, yeah, keep across each other. You know, back then he was doing some interesting work on Schadenfreude in the context of the Great Recession and the debt crisis in Europe, and we had a pretty interesting argument that you know, one of the reasons why subjective well-being was pretty resilient at the time was because of what was going on in Greece, and everybody felt a little bit better about themselves because of how high the debt burden was in Greece. And interestingly, this morning I saw a headline about how the U.S.'s debt burden is just about equal to Greece's now. And so I wonder, for a lot of different reasons, if you know if some of our European friends are going to be taking pleasure of the chaos in the United States right now, whether it's debt or any other thing that's going on. But COVID turned Nicolò into a demographer, apparently, and shift from Schadenfreude to thinking about fertility with a lot of very interesting studies published in a lot of high-profile publications like PNAS, Science, PDR, and we're going to hear a little bit about the latest iteration of that work today. So I'll turn it over to you. We'll take questions if you have them while we're going along, but we can certainly save it for the end as well. Thank you.
For this production, it's very good to be here and present in front of course, has been an easy great inspiration. It's good to be here, come together again. Can you hear me? Yes, is it fine? All right. All right, so I'm on my sabbatical. So I've been using this time to kind of try to reflect on the art of research that have been starting in 2020 during COVID. So today I will try a presentation that is kind of new style. So I wanted to offer you this kind of review of this research, of this art of research that has been going on with other people at Bocconi and other institutions for 5 years, and then show you what's happening now, what we're thinking about, what I'm thinking about now, and try to emphasize some of the questions that are open in this agenda that I hope to address maybe collaboratively after this month, like in a few months. All right, so the general interest is the effect of COVID-19 on some population variables, particularly as we're going to see is births, not the other way around. So why am I saying this? Not because I want to emphasize that I'm not doing the opposite of what I'm saying I'm doing, although that happens a lot in the genetic, and not because it's not an interesting question. So here I'm pointing to an important debate that happened in proceeding of science between the group led by Jennifer Dowd and Melinda Mills at Oxford concerning the role that intergenerational contacts had played in the early phases of the pandemic in determining the spread of the virus. So what they took the rate of intergenerational contact across Europe and correlated it to the infection rates and showed that countries that had higher intergenerational contact actually had higher infection rates, such as Italy and Spain. Arpino, Bordone, and Pasqualini rejoined and replied that if you look at the same relationship within Italy, you don't find that association anymore because southern regions who had more intergenerational contact actually had lower levels of infection. So this was a debate that was trying to take some structural kind of characteristics or some parameters of populations and across countries or across regions use it to explain an emergent phenomenon. So this is a structural demographic kind of like approach. What I'm interested in doing is to see how an emergent phenomenon that I kind of try to conceptualize as an exogenous phenomenon impacts some variables, some structures, some variables of the population, particularly birds. So, of course, you can still end up writing a regression or a model where you have birds on the left-hand side explained by COVID with endogeneity. For example, you can have structure of the population, the amount of people who are young, that determine the way in which COVID spreads, and also the number of birds. So you can still have an endogenous regression. We are I'm going to present very simple models where COVID-19 is just kind of a pre-post. We don't look at intensity, it's just kind of a temporal shift, a phase. And we look at what happens at birds in this phase. Actually, not birds, birth rates. So we kind of take the number of birds monthly, and I'm going to say something more about that, scale it by the median population, and that's the outcome variance. We use it also, generalized fertility rate, TFR, to kind of try to account for structure, but I'm just going to present you mainly results on birth rates. I would like to say the other outcomes kind of behave similarly, but as a demographer, I would say maybe let's talk about it in a more nuanced way. And so I'm not going to present anything about TFR. And we're going to do it on a quite homogeneous sample. Actually, this is the samples that we're going to use is generally the Wittgenstein Center's Human Fertility Database, short-term fertility fluctuation data set. And I've been thinking, what is the main, so they're all countries geographically at the north of the world. And one thing that characterizes them is that really they produce monthly statistics on birds. So that's what brings them together. So they have an administrative tradition of measuring at a high kind of like frequency birds, right? So that's our sample. So, just a general note. The things I'm presenting you, they don't have, they're like, this is the Biller's adaptation of the Coleman's demographic kind of explanation, the two stages of the demographic discovery, cleaned in the analytical sociology's river, washed in the river. So there are two stages. Discovery at the macro level, you look at data and you see what's happening. And then from there, you can move into explanation to think about the mechanisms that link macro to micro in the outcomes or action formation. So I'm going to present stage one. Just kind of be broad kind of views of fertility rates and how they moved in different phases of COVID. The other ones I'm going to try to show that starting from stage one is very fruitful for a lot of research questions on the explanation side that actually have been largely unaddressed in research. So there's many questions that are open, and hopefully some of you will take them up. Right, so the view from history. It was 2020, COVID hits, and with a group of people at Bocconi, we were thinking, okay, actually the debate was there's going to be a baby boom because people at home will have kids. And then we were thinking, okay, but we had instances of pandemics before. What is the inherited wisdom? What is the received wisdom from history? And here I'm referencing a 2000 classic kind of work by Massimo Livi Bacci, who studied extensively historical cases of pandemics, and not only pandemics, as they call it, he calls the mortality crisis. And you generally see or expect this kind of behavior. So in mortality crisis, births and deaths become intertwined, they become linked. So when you have an increase in deaths, that generates a variety of social adaptation, phenomena, uncertainty, depending on, of course, on the nature of the crisis, that lead about 9 months later to a true inverse, can be due to missing people, declining social mixing, can be linked to postponement, and then that gets recuperated later on. This I don't know if I pointer in this something like this second phase. So you expect decline, inverse, recuperation, and return to normal, or previous equilibrium, or to some sort of new normal. Right? And this is relatively squaring with historical experiences, especially the Spanish, so-called Spanish flu, the influenza. So you cannot see this very well, but this is portraits from the registration area of the US, so it's 27 states plus the District of Columbia, 65% of the US population. It's from Chandra and colleagues in 2018. All right, so the point here, this is 1990. So you see like this kind of through, and then these are 18, 17, 20, 21. So you have like some sort of going back to previous levels. This is US. There's been an extensive debate that still goes on Europe. This Mamelund showing death rates and birth rates for 3 belligerent countries, Italy, France, and Germany. And once again, you see a peak in deaths that kind of happens contemporaneously to a true inverse and however, debate of the role of the war versus the role of the disease, which were like, as we know, troops moving around, were bringing the disease, the influenza, and so a counterfactual that was available at the time was to compare these countries to non-belligerent countries, such as Sweden, Netherlands, Norway, where you don't see these high increase in deaths due to the war concurrent to the virus, still some, because you still have some infection, and then you have still a increase inwards. So you have heterogeneities in those experiences, and we're going to see these heterogeneities even today, across and within countries. Interestingly, this is a debate that is still continuing. I was a reviewer, I was the problematic reviewer for the Cavalli report paper. Here, they show that they try to disentangle what is the role of the war versus the, it's very good, they have novel findings. The role of the war versus the pandemic, what caused the so-called baby boom of the 20s. And they show that Norwegian, if I remember as well, and Dutch regions that were most strongly hit by the pandemic also had a milder recuperation later. So they say, so we would have expected that those who were hit more strongly would have more recuperation. Actually, what we tend to see is that in these divergences that I'm talking about, you see winners and losers. So some regions that are like suffering a lot. In this other paper that we haven't published, is myself, Philip Stroff, Sander Wagner, and Melinda Mills. We show, for example, in the US, counties that had suffered more also had worse recuperation. And an important moderating variable was non-pharmaceutical intervention. Here we digitized all the non-pharmaceutical interventions, and we saw that stronger interventions early on will lead to better outcomes in terms of lower fatalities and higher birth rates later on. Milder interventions, higher fatalities, lower birth rates. So you can see this kind of institutional nexus of divergence, not only due to the war. So it doesn't mean that I wouldn't even ask myself what's the cause of the behavior. We're looking at that. We're trying to make sense of that. So this is the group of people. We were thinking about these historical experiences. So we phoned Livi Bacci and asked him, so let's think about, since you're the expert, let's think about what's going on. How should we think about the pandemic, ongoing pandemic? This was 2020. And we kind of wrote a review of the research on the effect of historical pandemics on birds, coming up with the idea that we were not interested in predicting whether fertility would go up and down. Certainly not on the basis of past experiences, which can be a guide, but one should think about the differences in the demographic transition stage, how people are incentivized now, especially on the institutional mechanism and responses. So, and we had a worldview in the sense that we were trying to make a point of differentiating situations of people, countries, based on the socioeconomic status and the demographic transition stage at which they are. We never wrote a paper that we never published, we never put anywhere. So I thought I'll share it with you. We'll put it on OSF, but also the paper with Libby Bucks, we never used it. So what we did, we sent it to Science, and this was like a 40-page review with 150 references, and they told us, okay, can you make it in 2 pages and 15 references? And this came out as a perspective article on the COVID-19 pandemic in human fertility by the same group, where, as I was saying, we were trying to analyze the forces in determining fertility outcomes of COVID-19. So which stage of the demographic transition a country or society is, that kind of determines.
Sorry, do you think there's a different context though? Because the Spanish flu was particular. I mean, I can think how it would affect birth rate because it was killing mostly young men who would be having. Yes. So
The cohort was missing.
yeah. So don't you think it's totally different than other pandemics that affect different age groups, including COVID?
COVID, I completely agree. The fact that you have people dying in reproductive age is a direct effect on your natural birth rate, for sure. In COVID, this didn't happen, so the mechanisms of change in terms of fertility are different. And in fact, one of the points that I was trying to emphasize is that past experiences are historical research. We know there are, for example, one thing that people have been arguing in terms of the first, the Spanish, the influenza of 1918 was that one of the reasons why there was a baby boom was a simple psychological return to normalcy. That people celebrate return to normalcy even after the Second World War doesn't have to be necessarily. And this might happen after any potential crisis, no? But of course, the mechanism. And in fact, the kind of mechanisms that we were like looking at were for high-income countries were like the changes in work-life balance, the role of economic losses and uncertainty. We were thinking about access to assisted reproductive technology, which actually was not halted too much during this time. And each of these mechanisms has specific open kind of questions. So, for example, here, child, say, fertility in income countries sustained by the outsourcing of childcare, either to state, family, or market. During COVID, there was a forced re-internalization of childcare. So another question was, how would the couples divide labor, and who would take up the work, the additional hours of childcare or child rearing that were required during COVID. And we don't actually have a lot of work on that because of missing data, or not that I know. This was a ad hoc survey that was run by Adam Suppressor at Oxford and colleagues, showing that both US and UK, with women in heterosexual couples would take up more work and compared to men, and these might have implications in terms of maybe longer term implication. So we were discussing with Dave about this paper by Richard Breen, where they were looking at a specific disease, a colic, that newborn infants can have. So that's kind of random. So they were saying that happens randomly, but as it happens, you learn a lot about your partner's willingness to take care, to be a good, and they were showing that if you get a colic, then you are more likely to get divorced, no? Because you learn about the quality of your relationship later, straight away. And this kind of happens probably here as well, in the sense that as you internalize, you have to do more work. You know how much your partner is willing to put in, and we know equity in the child, in the homework, in whatever form of like care work is important, or we see it as an important factor in fertility. So here you can see across parties, people have more children, of course, there's a tougher problem to solve, but even kind of within, we might have differences in maybe even led by education gradients in the willingness of especially men to take up a higher share of work, and that can also potentially lead to maybe even positive outcomes. So if you learn a new equilibrium in which you share house chores more equally, then can actually lead to a positive birth outcomes later on. So these are like complex mechanisms that can be going one way or another that should be investigated, but I haven't seen much work on that. Other mechanisms, the role of economic losses and uncertainty. So this is Bailey and colleagues for the US, and we can see these are the birth rates for 4 or more years of college, US-born women, and less than 4 years. And you see a bifurcation, where you have a decrease in the birth rate for women with less than 4 years, and actually an increase, especially going out of COVID for more highly educated women. And this is instead the excess CBR. I'm going to talk about it later. So you can really see, the divergent destinies here caused by COVID and what's going on there. For sure, the fact that some work could be done remotely and some others couldn't count because your anxiety, stress is important. The fact that you might be able to do your job and keep your salary counts. And also the fact that you have intense economic cash transfers that were basically not progressive, so we not given to anyone, means that for people who would work at home, good salary plus a cash transfer, maybe there's also good incentive. So we have a paper on the child tax credit that kind of shows a small effect, but only on certain parts of the population that were not lower educated. So this is also a very important, I think, micro world to analyze how COVID impacted worlds by education or by socioeconomic status, and is still, I think, a bit unaddressed. All right, so of course we were just theorizing here. We were just kind of say, okay, this might be one channel, this might be another channel, but as empiricists, we also wanted to look at the data. So the same group, but now with Sanders, and not the Bacci, we started to work on the first released data by the Wittgenstein Center, Human Fertility Database, to see what was the early impact of COVID on birth rates. Here, let me see if I know to do this correctly. I will just show you the map of countries that we looked at. So these are the countries that I was mentioning before, are included in the database. And these are the countries we used. We didn't do any specific selection. And we kind of defined the pandemic cutoff 9 months after February 2020, November 2020. And for each country, we just estimated the simple regression. So data is dependent with some time trends. Actually, I think these are few people. What the time trend you want to absorb is the decline. So that was the PNAS paper. And we were kind of seeing something again, an heterogeneity, So Italy. So this is the cutoff, 9 months November, so it goes down. Netherlands, going up. France recuperating. So this is a degree to which the experiences of countries were differentiated. And then here, once again, we don't know exactly what was driving. We have one paper in PDR on the role of non-pharmaceutical interventions, but Zeman, Sobotka, and Wickler-Dorak has another paper with slightly different findings. So jury is out there what kind of caused the differentiation between countries. And these are the beta kind of this regression. What we could observe is a negative effect. These were like really few months, so like really early effect. Negative for some countries, we couldn't find a positive that time for other countries. We actually got an email for someone in Hungary who was very respectful in saying the results are wrong. Hungary has increased boards during the COVID pandemic. They might have been right, but I'll go back to this later. So what was it? So after this paper and concurrent with this paper, many others were published. At the same time, we had this May 2021 United Nations Population Division expert group meeting on this. So Vodka and colleagues have led with great papers the study of these heterogeneities. Then we have Omar, who looks at 24 European countries, Castro Torres and colleagues who look at Brazil and Colombia. Then we have regional studies, United States, Italy, Dallas One, Japan, China. And then look at this 2024, 2025. So this is really like an ongoing debate in the literature. There's going to be many more papers that will come out. At that time, we were like a bit more, less focused on the accounting of going up, going down, which country went up, which country went down, and we started working on institutional interventions. I have an appendix on this in case there's time. But then later on, with the new release of data from the Wittgenstein Center, we thought, okay, but what's going on now? So now it's 4 years, 5 years after the pandemic, so we can kind of look at some medium-run effects. And we rerun the analysis, and I will show you just kind of France as an example of what happened to birth rates up to December 2024. So relatively. So here it's a nice graph. I mean, I think so. This is just the birth rates. You see the immediate effect of COVID went down. Day of recuperation. So it's a kind of tempo. And then it goes down to zero. Actually, maybe here because of interventions, even too high, and then you kind of recuperate now. This is really Levi-Bacci 101, no? Sorry, it's really kind of Levi-Bacci. That's exactly the kind of things that we expect to see. France. That's the trend, just a linear trend. So that's the prediction, and these are predictions, right? So because we stop learning from here, and then we project. The distance between the blue line and the blue points are excessive, the surprise. Here we're above, below, above. And this is what happened in France. This is if you compute excess CBR, so the distances from these points to this line, and plot it for all the countries in the database, you see this. Here are no differential. So again, you see this. Of course, here excess CBR is 0. We are learning from this data, so it should be 0 or around 0. From here, we're not learning anymore. So this is COVID. Sorry, dates are not. So you see it goes down. I told you it would be like a bit of reading the coffee. Or it just goes down, recuperation. Then what happens after? So okay. The Levi-Bacci France, I would expect that in the following months, then you see like all countries going back to some sort of. If I project these excessive years, so, and this is where we were talking about divergence, because we see that actually the countries don't go back, they kind of stretch farther away, first explanation, problem with my analysis. So there must be some problem. What's the problem actually? That if you stop doing less, okay, it's a good predictor on the data based on the assumption. Here we do well. For a few months, maybe we have good predictions. For 4 years later, I don't know if we learned well enough from the data that end in the 2020 for what happens in 2024. So just the fit of our prediction or the quality of our prediction just go down. Yes.
You could also do that by just taking a 4-year holdout of a historic sample and then do the exact same thing and just compare it to that.
What we want to do is we play with this kind of models. So we try to learn about the drift of the models, changing the windows. In fact, we're kind of, sorry for the notation, but the idea is that we can decompose the error in the real error and the model error, and then we can learn through cross-validation. Actually, we can even play with many models. Here we have 35 models, different estimation windows to try to take out the noise due to the model. And there was about 8.5% of the total bias due to this model-based induced. And so when we do that, we can recompute XSCBR net of model noise. And now I also put colors, but but it's still like that. So the gray ones are the model, so it kind of increases variance before COVID, but doesn't really help us close the gaps of divergence after. So this is why we were thinking maybe this is something real happening in terms of divergence. So these are models. So let's look actually at the data, because that's when I have a doubt, I look at the data. Okay, so this. So I created just kind of a small app that allows us to look at all countries under different modeling assumptions. So here I'm just going to go for linear. You can play with the training, so with the data you use. I don't know if you can see it, but this is again the France graph. So you have CBRs, the linear trend. This is Australia. No? So you see the increase, so no decline, increase in COVID. Now it's going to be boring. We're going to go through all of the countries. Okay, just to show you. This is Austria. Okay, here is one example where the linear trend is not really a great fit. I can let's see if it changes. Okay, so now we kind of have this. Again, we have higher than expected birth rates, even in the quadratic form, because in the end we don't really care too much about the assumption. Belgium again. So we have some countries that didn't have strong decline, but still increase in births during the lockdowns. The second bar here is 2022. It's basically at the end of COVID. Similar to Norway, Netherlands in the non-belligerent country example of Hungary. We have some other countries that actually Czechia here loses 20% in the past 2 years. It's like significant. Denmark as well has this. All these countries have relatively smooth. Denmark also goes down quite a lot. Finland, who's Finland was really down. Germany as well. Goes back to the levels of 2012 in terms of birth rates. Hungary, okay, maybe not all of them, but point is we see these divergence. These are not model-based estimates. These are the birth rates. We see that some countries, so we see some effects of COVID. Here we see the Netherlands, for example, just as like baby boom, so to speak, and no effect of COVID whatsoever. We see some countries were relatively resilient, and some countries that in the past few years have actually seen a quite dramatic drop in birth rates. Poland 10 to 7 in 2014. They're like quite big, and sudden kind of drops in birth rates in these countries. Korea has been relatively stable. Okay, I'm done. Sweden as well. Switzerland. So this is the divergence. So it's actually not. It seems to be not a mere artifact of the way in which we train the model, but we actually can see it in the data if we plot, and this is just one example, cases where over the past couple of years, we don't go to trend, assuming that, of course, trend is modeled, so might be not perfect, but we really see this kind of intense drops. What is happening? I don't know. If we plot, and this is kind of the area of divergence, sorry for like multicolored slides, but this is just the CBR of all countries from 2012, sorry, to 2024 by group. So, and here we see like, this is where we talk about divergence. Here we see some overlap, essentially Central and Eastern Europe with Western and Northern. Of course, we have the extremes of Southern Europe and Anglo-Saxon, as these are Australia, UK, US, Canada, and that's here. But here we have a quite degree of overlap that kind of becomes a kind of three versions. I don't know that in the last. So it seems like I don't know. It seems like there is a degree to which regimes seem to explain, no, levels of fertility. Of course, here we're talking about small numbers, so not that big differences. But Southern European countries are low, and Western European countries, which are the countries that actually had increasing, you see also here, no, kind of decrease in the south, increase in the north, and that kind of like state. It was not shock, return to trend. It was actually, we see at least in the medium, you can call it medium term, like some sort of divergence. So here I wanted to put this picture, not only because of the great French style of Morin, but also because we went back to this concept of the Polycrisis that Morin develops building on Heidegger's concept of planetary era through technology, interconnection of regimes, the planetization. So after COVID was just the start of a set of crises. It's inflation, war, trade wars, and different countries appear to have responded in different ways. It's not by maybe mistake that those countries that have such declining rate are Czechia, Poland, Hungary, Germany. So these are all countries that have a former Soviet history to a degree, and there was an invasion of Ukraine in the meanwhile. So the point is this idea of uncertainty. How do you deal as system, as person, with a polycrisis era where definitely many degrees, many sources of vulnerability or crisis can impact your life, your decision, and that's where both institutional systems and individual resources count to maintain possibly your life course desire and plans. So, point, COVID works. Okay, we see an immediate impact in the PNAS paper, short term, not for everyone, the same, and we see recuperation at various degrees. We see cases of increased fertility without fast, and we don't know exactly if it was cash transfers, just lockdown. There's a lot to unpack there as well. We see important within country gradients in socioeconomic status in the transitions to furthermore to higher parities, furthermore happening at the same time. These are papers about the increasing prerequisite of income in the life course transition before, but it's in a way possibly exacerbated this kind of like gradients and differences. And there is a space to study institutional responses that, again, even in these two papers that I mentioned, are approached in a kind of like maybe amateur, I'm part of the co-authors of one, but amatorial kind of way where you think about welfare state as a system. Okay, we have the continental, the southern Europe, while it's important to think about which kind of treatment people were given during COVID, which and when. And after COVID, okay, today what I try to show is that here's a divergence between countries. What explains this? We discussed this idea of polycrisis to emphasize the role of uncertainty. So in an era of increased uncertainty, people deal with that and kind of like employ strategies to maintain their life course plans, but they do it with different endowments and with different institutional support. And this is part of my ongoing project. I got this grant from the Cavalli Foundation to study the new transitions to adulthood. How do people see their steps to adulthood? How do people cope with uncertainty? But this we're in the field right now, so maybe next sabbatical, I'll be able to present something. So I think for now I can stop and there are questions.
I'm curious about this idea of kind of polycrisis in the context of COVID, where there was like everything was upended and the crisis or kind of this suspension or interruption to institutions lasted varying times. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about kind of the meso level crisis that you're expecting and discuss kind of the mechanisms where this is happening?
I agree that it's not enough to say crisis and then everything is the same. No, in fact, during COVID, certainly the proximal cause for not having kids was fear of infection, or the child, or the person, or meeting other people. So there was a specific way in which people abstained from maybe meeting or reproducing or having kids. And if I mention then in the paper that we were writing, we then say, but after COVID, then there was inflation. And inflation causes a real decline in income, or decline in real income. And we can, for example, compare, however, that if we countries such as these Eastern European and Southern European countries, we can use, actually there's a paper by one of our co-authors that has been under review in PDR, uses the price inflation of consumer goods and also of energy goods as an explanatory variable for imports. But then you have countries like Italy, Spain that actually have huge increases in the cost of energy, but no decline in imports, not as much for sure as the ones in the Eastern European countries. So that mechanism is, they argue that it's not what causes, it's not just kind of a decline in disposable income that causes. What might be a factor if you believe that your time frame is going to be an invasion or a war, maybe you're staying from postponing the way that you recovery. That might explain why certain countries were like particularly exposed to this decline. So different crises have different mechanisms, including the influenza. We cannot put the same everyone's head on every crisis. However, the point that we want to emphasize, I don't know if I'm answering your question, is this kind of COVID as the start of an era of increased uncertainty for life course transitions, where not only you have increased prices, but also you have view of the future that becomes more sophisticated, and the narratives about it as well. No, including environmental crisis. There's papers by Daniele Vignoli, Ryan Mitterak, who really talk about the narratives of the future and how seeing the future changes, you know, our behaviors now. So in that sense, we wanted to talk about polycrisis as a regime of uncertainty that we see, maybe because we don't prove it, but we argue might be one of the reasons why we see these kind of changes, which are very common in birth rates. TFR should be more resistant to that in a way, but we also see that also that goes down because there's less turbulence. And another thing that of this, which is related to this concept of planetization, the idea is that the interconnectedness of the system makes it so that a crisis in one place might have direct or indirect effects in another place. And clearly, the effects are mediated or moderated by the way in which the history of that country or like the institutional setup of that country operates. So these are let's say complex interdependencies that I think are really fruitful for research, but we are starting to now. We haven't even started to scratch because, as you see, I just got the portraits. That's my presentation. Yeah.
Maybe Emilio wants to ask a question, but I was wondering about just migration. What do we know about migration happening in this context? And well, I'm thinking about like how countries' birth rates were differently dependent on migrant populations before the pandemic, and also how, you know, institutional responses to the pandemic impacted migrant flows and all of those things. Which is also like, I don't know if the TFR by looking at like age specific, you can sort of like disentangle some of those things as well.
So for that's increase in Germany, that's migration.
Right.
This is 2015, you have 1 million people coming in, so you have increase. And that's part of the recuperation of Germany birth rates was due to migrants. This effect has disappeared. Of course, the regimes have changed of migration in Europe as well. Have changed. Here was a real inflow. Austria is the same. Now I want to go to, because Austria was the other country we first had. If we were looking at Austria. Austria as well here. You see really the effect of the so-called refugee crisis. So the influx of refugees in Europe, that of course benefited. Those terms of Germany, Austria, you don't see that in Italy. They want to stay in the US, we see that, and this was discussed by Kenny and Levine, that the decrease in births happened before 9 months. And the reason was that closing borders implied that fewer people were coming in, and because 1/3 of US births non-US born women, then you already saw an effect, which is institutional regime. What's interesting is that Poland also got a strong increase in Ukrainian refugees. No, because all of those Eastern European countries got an inflow from Ukraine, but we don't see. Of course, here we don't know anything because
back fighting.
So it's really different, no regimes. Maybe even short thinking of when we here for the short term versus the longer term, the increased Europe. As you know, there is an active pushback against migration, open migration policies throughout all of the countries, and so that can also be a factor. But I absolutely agree, and this will be an important step forward. If we look at age specific, so what's driving this kind of overall value? What's going on? My feel is that it's not higher educated and older people. I think probably they are like maintaining, but I don't, because there's no data.
Yeah, just to add to that, so those are macro, and you gave sort of like the explanation as institutional response, the idea. But you mentioned Bailey, for example, looking at within country, right? The trend in the US being very different from highly educated women in lower. Have you looked at, those kinds of differences within country differences? Because maybe it's all about SES education or, not so much the institutional.
In my view, it's a big
Part of the-
That's a big
yes.
part. Of course, low, high educated population, at least in most of these countries, is small. So if you have a strong decline for non-educated, we looked at Italy. We are working with eStart. We have these two measurements. One of intentions in 2018.
That's what I was.
Okay. But that's those are the you always think intentions and then realization, always intentions. But then we look at realization just before and after COVID. So intentions for 3 years, measured in 2018. So that, and we see that highly educated women who had a positive intention realized, and with a negative intention also had more children. So it was the whole cohort was pushed upwards in terms of while the lower educated, I say lower educated is college, non-college, who wanted to have children didn't, or didn't as much, and who didn't want it. So you can really see this kind. With this data, we don't have. Within education, I talked to INED to see this. They told me, yeah, you can work on samples. You can work on samples. I want to count the population, but it's difficult to then go and look at the education. In California data, you have something in the US with quite the registries, but then you don't have in the public access the country within state the state differentiation. So there is a data work that needs to be done.
Yeah. So just to add, you mentioned fertility intentions, and so we are looking at intentions to, we'll talk later, but we are finding divergence in intentions and in realized and who could realize or not, in all kinds of
Yes.
by education. And
But that makes sense.
intentions. That makes total sense. Yeah, the divergence is there as well, and not only in the countries. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Fascinating, thank you. I was looking at your scales and the shapes of your
I
graphs.
knew.
It was back in
It's a mess.
No, but like in all of this literature in fertility, we always think that it's going to decline and then go back up. Like it's like divorce, we always think that it cannot. Where is fertility going? I was in this one. I was looking at, and I think Italy was always at the bottom in the scale. So when you say that the after the pandemic is going to go back to what? So it's like is it and it connects with. I look at your graphs and it's just amazing.
Yeah.
They all have the negative slope and with their fluctuations stuff like that. So. Is there like a bottom? Is there like, should we think about a model that actually is not gonna go lower than this? It's like this is conversions to the bottom or something like that?
In a way, so
Yeah.
on one hand, there's a degree. So there's a question on both extensive and intensive marriages. So and then for sure, fewer people are having kids. Those who are having children, maybe they will like more, so you can say, okay, those who are having a bit more, or like, so I looked at Korea because that's one of the lowest, maybe the lowest. And here, if we plot the trend, then like they're kind of like, so is it because they reached, so no one, like they reached the extensive marriage who doesn't want to have kids? I don't know. We don't know. We can go to zero, but that's possible. It is possible. It's not impossible. Then so this I think there are even persons in this room that have much clearer ideas on this than me, but what we see in Korea, also Italy, if we plot this kind of data, they're like still going down. That's the mode of development, but like trying. I mean, easy that here we're like 6.5 per watt, so really like small numbers. Lowest low, low. No, so I don't know. When we talk about going back to trend, is this idea, no, that whatever it's the Netherlands, sorry, now I'm going back and forth, but it's something like this. There's a trend, then there's a shock, then you go back to trend. Can be up, can be down. But what we were seeing in this kind of countries such as Czechia, Hungary, even Germany, it's really difficult to find. Yes, okay, there might be an inflection. You might kind of model it in a way that is, but the amount of losses in the is significant. And here we're talking about 10, now we're 7, so we're basically Italy. So, and in these countries, Eastern European countries that have high fertility rate, of course, and we're also coming from, and they're also coming from natalist policy, environment, Hungary as well. But this is also proposed. I don't know if they saw this data. They will be worried. Because of the way they think about it.
Very good, yeah, no, it's.
Well, why don't we give Nicolò a round of applause? We'll be lingering around the rest of the visits and around tomorrow if you have questions as well. We have an office for you.